Welcome to the Wisdom of the Body Summit, an online event to align with your body's intelligence for healing, optimal living, and spiritual awakening. Brought to you by Sounds True. Throughout this summit, 32 experts will share practical tools and breakthrough insights that have emerged from the convergence of science and time-honored perspectives from the world's spiritual traditions. As we learn to recognize and honor the incredible wealth of knowledge that lies within our bodies, we can begin to listen and attend to ourselves more fully, opening a doorway to greater health and well-being. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm excited to welcome medical scientist, teacher, author, cell health expert, and photographer of inner space, Dr. Sondra Barrett. For this session, Sondra will be sharing a presentation titled Awaken to Your Cellular Intelligence. Welcome, Sondra.
Oh, thank you, Christy. I'm really excited to be here, to be able to share what our cells know. Okay, let's start to share Awaken to Your Cellular Intelligence. First slide. So this presentation is based on the book that Sounds True published of mine a number of years ago called Secrets of Your Cells. And since the book was published, I've learned a lot more about the cells and their intelligence. So we build on the cellular intelligence from the book and expand upon that. And in the next slide, I share with you what my intention and the goals for what you should gain out of the presentation. One, I want you to fall in love with your cells. I was going to call this Romancing Your Cells, but it didn't quite fit into the overall topic of body, mind, wisdom. So I'm intending from you to learn about your cells that you will have a whole new relationship with your body, that you'll fall in love, and that you'll use the knowledge that I share to be able to tap into the wisdom that's within you, the cellular intelligence, and to know where that is and that it's real, it's not just an abstract idea, and to ultimately discover that this intelligence and the wisdom of our cells, in my opinion, has given rise to ancient wisdom. It's what our ancient teachers knew. And in the next slide, you see a little bit more of what the cells I'm talking about. These are, one on the right is an illustration of a cell. And just cells are abstract to most people, I know that. And so to really be able to recognize that our cells are real, this picture on the right is an illustration. And I'm not going to go into all the anatomy or architecture of the cell, but just for you to appreciate that there's a million biochemical activities going on in each cell every nanosecond. So they're pretty complex and intelligent. And the cells on the left of the picture are actual photomicrographs, which will show you the part of the cells that really hold the cellular intelligence. And so the intention for this presentation is to show you where in the cells the anatomy for cellular intelligence is, what it is, and how to access it. And I will cover later in the presentation practices that are coming from ancient traditions that, in my perspective, are cellular practices. So in the next slide, I'm trained as a biochemist. I had no experience of cellular wisdom or cells at all. Biochemists study the chemistry of the body, the chemistry of life. And when I took a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, I picked a project that was as close to biochemistry as I thought was possible. And it certainly opened my eyes and my understanding about life in a much greater way than biochemistry did. So the picture on the right is actually a photomicrograph of a living human white blood cell. And on the left is my microscope that I still use. I hadn't used a microscope as a biochemist, but to learn about cells, I had to. And my intention my research goal was to be able to understand how normal white blood cells function and be able to measure objective criteria about normal cells to be able to use in the next picture we see, to be able to use in understanding leukemia cells. And leukemia cells are cancers of the white blood cell. So my research was to be able to develop objective diagnostic criteria for human leukemias. And the reason I was doing that, basically, I would sit in clinical conferences and hear physicians argue whether someone had a leukemia and what kind it was. And as a biochemist where everything is measurable, I was really surprised that diagnosis of a cancer or an illness wasn't always objective. So I intended to find ways to objectify so that people aren't going through, do I have it or do I not have it? And the next slide, you see a little boy. Most of the leukemias I was studying were in children with cancer, children with leukemia. And a dad came up to my lab, since I was the only lab at the university who was developing objective ways to diagnose leukemias. A dad came up to my lab and asked me, would I photograph his son's cells? Why did he want that? This was in the 70s, way early when imagery was still considered woo-woo. And he wanted to use the photomicrographs of his son's cells so his son could use that for imagery. Imagine that these leukemia cells, these abnormal cells were disappearing. And that really gave me the idea to start going down to pediatric oncology. Every Tuesday afternoon, I went to the clinic and did slideshows, the old kind of slideshows, showing children normal cells, healthy cells, cancer cells, along with one of the side tracks I got into was photographing molecules of life through the microscope, the same kind of microscope I was photographing cells with. So I began sharing with the kids their inner beauty. They may be experiencing outer beauty from the effects of treatment, and yet here I wanted to show them, here we've got on the bottom left is vitamin B12, and on the right is table salt. And I wasn't doing these slideshows for children to cure their disease, although I was hoping that could happen. I was really sharing this information, these pictures, to occupy their time while they were waiting for chemotherapy. So it took me out of the laboratory. I'm a laboratory trained scientist, and here I'm down every week spending time with children and their families who are facing a life-threatening illness. So it made me ask questions I hadn't not been asking as a scientist at all. And the next slide, one of the questions was, what is healing? I thought, when I started my career, I thought if we understood the chemistry of the body, we could fix anything that was broken. And then as I morphed into studying cells, if we understood how cells work and how they're broken, can we fix it? Can we cure any illness? And in the bigger story of my work, I was training physicians to do research. And they would come in and say, one of those turning points I had, they would come in and say, oh, Mrs. So-and-so stopped responding to chemotherapy. Mrs. So-and-so with this acute leukemia, because we were the lab in the university who were studying all leukemias and lymphomas. She stopped responding to chemo. And his conclusion, the physician's conclusion, was she would be dead within a couple of months. And I remember that with this one particular patient, she didn't die. In fact, she stayed alive for a number of years. She had these events going on in her life, a grandchild's graduation from college, her wedding anniversary. So there were all these events that were going on in her life. Even though she wasn't responding to chemo, she stayed alive for another couple of years. And that didn't make any sense to me. It's like, how is that possible? The model I learned was you get an illness and you don't respond to treatment, that's it. So there were questions that I continue to still ask. What are the other dimensions of healing besides our biology? Mind wasn't included in this time in the 70s. Mind was not included in our understanding about the body at all. Next slide, please. So beside what is healing, I get into discussions with my neuroscientist friends who say cells can't possibly be intelligent. Intelligence is about being able to write a book, be able to think clearly. When here we've got two different perspectives on intelligence. Stephen Hawking says intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, and you'll see cells certainly know how to do that. And according to, I call him my spiritual godfather, Albert Einstein, the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. So it's bringing in the mind, it's bringing in the spirit into other aspects of what is intelligence. But still, as a scientist, I had to prove in the next slide what I believe, what I see is cellular intelligence. And intelligence basically is being able to take information and solve problems. And if we look at what our cells do to be able to survive, first of all, they have to be able to recognize danger. They have to be able to recognize is what's coming into their area and their environment a friend or a foe? Do they need to get rid of it? And in this same slide that we see here, this is human white blood cell. And its job is to protect us against infection. It's the first line of defense against bacterial infection. And so early on, when I first started using the microscope, I wasn't really talking about intelligence to myself. I was just thinking how amazing these living creatures were, that I did leap into, there had to be a God, there had to be something more that could create something as smart as this invisible creature that is able to recognize that there's something not self in its environment and be able to go after that. And in this case, what this creature, this white blood cell, is able to recognize that there's a cell from another species in its environment, and it's able to recognize that this is a red blood cell. It can't recognize, I don't think, which species, but this happens to be a red blood cell from a sheep. So it's able to recognize potential danger. And if that was a bacteria, this white blood cell would be able to kill that bacteria and dismantle it, do the ultimate recycle. And so in that kind of glimpse at watching this move on the last slide, I just thought how smart and how sacred we are, that we have these living entities in us that know how to take care of us. So part of that intelligence is certainly recognition of, is there anything that could be threatening in the environment? And then to be able to translate that information. So we've got information, is it dangerous, is it safe? To be able to translate that into action. And to me, that's intelligence. Like, well, how does it know? I'm, how many years later, I'm still asking these questions. How do these little guys know this? Yet they do. And they are able to communicate with others in their environment and get the job done. So communication is another part of that intelligence. And part of intelligence is to be able to produce the energy when they need it and to be able to move that energy to where it's needed. And some of this relates to what is life? What are the definitions for life, since it's a living cell? And believe it or not, scientists still do not agree on what is living. My job for this presentation is, well, what is intelligence? And prove to me that cells have intelligence. So in the next slide, we're going to look at a beginning of cellular intelligence. How do cells communicate to another? Of course, they've got cell phones. They were the first cell phones. And the diagram on the slide represents a cell with antenna on the surface that's being able to pick up information. And if we look at the next slide, we can actually see on the bottom of the slide, you can see an illustration of the cell membrane. So the outside of the cell has receptor sites or antenna on it that's able to pick up information. And the way it's able to recognize information, the picture on the left above the cell membrane is a photomicrograph of adrenaline. So when we're excited or nervous or fearful or stressed, one of the first molecules our cells produce is adrenaline. And adrenaline, you see, has a very different shape than the photomicrograph on the right, which is caffeine. And the way our cell receptors work, they recognize by shape. So you can see all these different protrusions in the cell membrane have different shapes. And it's only by virtue of the shape of the receptor that it can recognize a specific molecule. Only cells that would have receptors for adrenaline can respond to it. And many of our drugs are built to block receptor sites. For instance, people who have high blood pressure are often given beta blockers. Well, a beta blocker mimics the shape of adrenaline and will block the receptor site so adrenaline can't get on those heart cells and cause it to beat faster. And I mean, it's pretty amazing that the cells evolved this way or were designed this way. So we have receptor sites, which are antennae on the surface that can recognize information. And on the next slide, we look at, well, where is this information coming from? The information is coming from what we're feeling, what we're thinking. Molecules of peace, of love, of fear are spewed out into the environment of our cells, our cellular universe, and our cells are listening to what we're sending out, what we're broadcasting. And we can see on the diagram on the left that we have receptor sites that are able to recognize specific information that we're sending. And I know I say it later on, but I'm going to say it now because it's really important. Our cells are always in the now. We have spiritual teachers, Ram Dass, Eckhart Tolle, who've told us, be in the present moment. Well, that's the only way our cells are. They're always in the present moment, unless our thoughts, ideas, feelings are taking them someplace else. So a mantra is, my cells are always in the now when you start going into someplace else. And in the next slide, we get to see the overall picture of cellular intelligence. So we have two, in my perspective, we have two aspects of anatomical cellular intelligence. One is the cell receivers, the receptors on the outside of the cell, but that's only enough to recognize information. Something inside the cell must respond to the information. And the inside of the cell is called the cytoskeleton. Probably most of you watching this, like me, when you had learned cell biology, whenever that was, if you did, you just learned that there's a cell membrane, there's a nucleus, and then there's jello, watery jello in the rest of the cell. There was not a fabric. And in fact, in the past 20 years, we've learned that there's this fabric of the cytoskeleton, which is actually, in my interpretation, the decision maker and the most important, yeah, I'm biased, the most important part of our cells. And if we look at the next slide, so the cytoskeleton is this webbing or fabric or matrix, and it's made up of different size strands, if you will. There are microtubules that are the largest of the fabric. We have intermediate filaments. We have microfilaments. It's the connective tissue or the muscle inside the cell. And I like to look at this. Our cells are string instruments, and you'll see why I say that in a couple of minutes. So in the next slide, let's see where we are here. In the next slide, we get to look at the idea that the cytoskeleton is essential. One, we knew it was essential for moving the cell. The cell has to change shape in order for that white blood cell you saw earlier to go after a microorganism, needs to change its shape, it needs to be able to move. We knew the cytoskeleton was important for that. And so changing shape and tension of the cell is essential for this access of cellular intelligence. And if we look at the next slide, what changed my life and understanding, I didn't learn about the cytoskeleton at all as a biochemist, or even when I was studying how cells work. I didn't learn about cellular intelligence and the cytoskeleton until 20 years ago, 1998. There was a wonderful article in Scientific American called The Architecture of Life, which I happened to buy because I was curious. And this is incredible research that came out of Harvard University. Donald Ingvar, a physician scientist, who was able to show if you put cells in a plastic dish, in order for cells to grow, they have to attach first. So he saw that when the cells were attached in the dish, they were expressing the gene to reproduce itself. And in real life, not just in a plastic dish, if we get a cut, the cells need to be able to reproduce to fill that space. So they're stretched out, they're attached to each other, and they're expressing the gene, make more, reproduce. And then in the dish, what Ingvar was able to show, when the cells let go of a little bit of their attachments, sound like Buddhism, when the cells let go of their attachments, they express a different gene. They express genes to mature. And an example, if we get a viral infection, the first trigger is the immune cells, the lymphocytes, have to make more immune cells that recognize that virus. But that's just reproduction. And the next stage is now they have to mature to be able to handle that virus. So they'll make antibodies or they'll make different molecules that are be able to attack the virus. So there's a normal process of reproducing cells and maturing the cells. And then in the dish, the final altruistic activity, if you will, of a cell is if there's not enough food for everybody in the dish, the cells will let go of all of their attachments and ball up and program their cell death. And when I was growing cells in the laboratory, and I would come in the morning in the flask and I saw a bunch of balls of cells, although I didn't know this part of it, I knew that they had died. So here we've got 3 stages. The cells in the dish all had the same genes, but only depending on the amount of tension and attachment to the cells did certain genes get expressed. So this was hallmark work that Ingvar did, and it's growing into a major way we understand almost everything, stress and cancer as well, which I'll get into in another program. So we've got changing tension on the cells makes a difference on what genes will be expressed. And if we look at the next slide, the next 2 slides, we basically just see Ingvar's diagrams of how the cell changes shape. Shape is important in recognizing information and being able to respond to information. And in the next slide, we look at the reality of what happens when we're relaxed or when we're stressed. Our cells are responding. And if we look at the fist in this picture, and I'm going to ask you to make a fist, just make a gentle fist. And in the next slide, we recognize that if you make a fist and if you are tense, that tension doesn't just stay in your fist. It's moving up your arm. It's moving up to your, perhaps up to your shoulder. It may even move up to your jaw. So you might not be aware of what's happening when you're experiencing tension or stress, yet we recognize that everything's connected. We've got a diagram here of the connective tissue, the latest found organ in the human body. The connective tissue is basically connected to the cytoskeleton. It's like a cytoskeleton, if you will. And when we're feeling tension, if you're feeling tension in your shoulders, the rest of your body is responding, even though you might not be aware. So when I remind you that your cells are in the now, just start becoming aware of what you're experiencing in your body. If I'm experiencing tension in my shoulders, it's more than what's happening just in my shoulders. I'm influencing every other part of my body. So it's like letting go of tension is really important aspect of our healing. And let me go. So we'll go to the next slide. And this aspect of tension on the cells is actually a universal principle of design, of architecture, of life beyond our cells. It's called Tensegrity, and the term comes from Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller designed a tensegrity structure, the geodesic dome. And what a tensegrity structure is a structure that's able to balance the forces from inside and from outside and maintain its integrity. So it's a balancing compression and tension. And Ingvar was able to, he was studying design as a medical student and came up with this whole idea that our cells are tensegrity structures. And then we learned, and because the cells do have to balance tension when they're moving or when they're growing or when they're expressing their genes, they need to be able to balance what's going on. And our molecules, up in the right-hand corner, we see a computer graphic of DNA. Our molecules are, everything is moving. Everything is moving in our cells. Everything is moving in our molecules. And so that's a kind of vibration, a structural change that has to be balanced so that the molecule or the cells don't fall apart. And if we look at the next slide, Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose came up with the idea and some science that indicated that, in fact, the microtubules, that part of the cytoskeleton, actually carried consciousness. They were looking at neurons, microtubules and neurons, and Hameroff, as an anesthesiologist, was able to show that if you give people or animals anesthesia, the microtubules are frozen or dismantled, and then there's not everyday consciousness. So his conclusion was, in fact, that consciousness of the brain was related to the microtubules. Well, every cell in the body has microtubules. So my contention is every cell has consciousness, and the body is important in being able to access that consciousness. And if we look at the next slide, if you think of serendipity or synchronicity, how I got into looking at any of this was one seeing, I was at a bookstore in Northern California, and there was an article in Scientific American, as I mentioned, called The Architecture of Life. And on the cover, it's something about tensegrity. And also in that same bookstore on the same shelf was a yoga journal article on tensegrity by Carlos Castaneda. And I thought, how are these two related? Well, obviously I bought both magazines, and Carlos came up with the idea. Some say it's accurate, some say it's supposition or myth. He came up with the idea that there are physical practices that were handed down by the ancient sorcerers that change consciousness. He never talked about cellular tensegrity. He called these Tensegrity practices. But he said if you did these movements, you were going to be able to change your consciousness. And there are people that the movements are called magical passes, and there are people who do teach these practices and say their consciousness changed. Consciousness meaning a state of mind. And sort of related to it, Felicitas Goodman was an anthropologist who was interested in pre-Columbian art. And what she noticed was in pre-Columbian art, there were certain postures that were exhibited in many of these statues. And she was curious because she was also interested in consciousness. She was curious, were these postures related to changing consciousness? And she had her graduate students in anthropology adapt these different postures and saw, in fact, that they did change their state of mind. And if we look at this picture of Buddha, we know in yoga there are mudras that relate to changing how we feel. And I know there's been some research on palms that are up. You're more receptive to information compared to palms that are down. So I like to think that our body can change our mind because it's really hard to change our mind. And there's some suggestions that certain body postures can influence how we feel. And if we look at the next slide, we see the popularity of yoga. Yoga helps reduce stress. It puts us in a different state of mind. It's one of the most acceptable practices for managing stress. What is stress? Stress is a state of consciousness, a perception in our mind. So we can change our physical posture, do a series of movements that will change our state of mind. And in the next slide, we see we don't necessarily have to do yoga. We could do Qigong or Tai Chi. We don't even need to do some prescribed movements. We could just do some stretching. We could do some movement. Will change the consciousness, will change our consciousness. I know if I go out for a walk, it's going to make a difference in how I feel. I'm changing the cytoskeleton in my cells. And in the next slide, we see the more I learn about the cytoskeleton, the more excited I am about it. Recently, I just read a couple of weeks ago that the cytoskeleton is working by changing mechanical responses. And researchers have discovered that the mechanical signals are actually faster than the hormonal or the molecular signals. So I can change my posture a lot faster than changing my stress level. And that's going to change my physiology and it's going to change my consciousness and my mind and my healing. So we recognize that certainly doing something physical, how important our bodies are, doing something physical can change our overall body-mind much faster than the molecular changes. The cytoskeleton is changing all the time. Sometimes the microtubules in some experiments are dismantling and rebuilding every 10 minutes. So we're very fluid in what we're able to do at a cellular level. And that's really important to recognize. In fact, although I don't usually talk about it in this conversation, as our cells mature, they become more flexible and more fluid. And I always like to ask people, well, as you mature, are you becoming more rigid or more fluid, more flexible? Our cells are always those teachers. And the cytoskeleton has lots of different roles. Obviously, it's the part of the cell I have fallen in love with. It's not only the movement of move the cell and move information. It also, when something is produced inside the cell, like a protein, it has to move to where it's needed. So the cytoskeleton is also like the train system to be able to pick up, oh, you've made this protein, now I need to move it over to the cell membrane. And then it knows how to do this. That's intelligent too. And we see that the cytoskeleton is really important in the stress response, and there's lots of research now that's showing that the cytoskeleton influences whether or not a cell can become a cancer cell, another conversation. And in the next slide is an overview of what we understand our cytoskeleton to be influenced by and what it influences. It's influenced by stress. It's influenced by tension. That's pretty obvious if we think about this is the structure in the cell that responds to our physical tension. Also, what's really key in our understanding healing and the new kind of healing, it responds to vibration. It's responding to energy. It's responding to sound. And in my interpretation, the cytoskeleton is that place in our cells. We have an architectural place inside our cells where energy and vibrational healing occur. Sometimes we need evidence to really say that something works, especially in the medical model we have, and having an anatomical place, a real place, not just an imaginal place in the brain that something may be happening, but that it can happen in our cells is really important to help convince people to use strategies that maybe they wouldn't test out for their own healing, like using sound or chanting. And in the next slide, we see, as I mentioned earlier, our cells are string instruments. And what do we know about string instruments? You pluck one string, the nearby strings start vibrating. You hit a drum, a head of a drum, other drum heads will start vibrating. And we can see, as in this next slide, that the strings vibrate, our cells are vibrating. And I started teaching an online stress management program last year. And I was always talking about humming and sound, more from an intuitive appreciation that it works, or there may be a place in our cells that respond to sound. A wonderful book came out last fall by Jonathan Goldman, a sound healer, and it was on the humming effect. And he actually documents the research on what 5 minutes of humming can do in terms of improving our health. It lowers the stress hormones, it lowers blood pressure, it increases nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the molecule that helps relax blood vessels. It increases endorphins, which help diminish pain. It increases oxygen in the cells, so the cells are able to produce more energy. It improves lymphatic circulation, which improves immune function. So it's aligning all of these cells in our own health, and just not just from data perspective. In teaching the course I was doing online, I would also add coaching to it. And one of the first students in the class was a nurse who did energy healing, and she couldn't change her mind chatter. And she knew meditation, she was teaching meditation. There was nothing that changed her mind chatter. But what she discovered was if she just did a few minutes of the humming one tone, not humming a song, but just humming a tone, that she was able to turn off that mind chatter. And I continue as I continue to teach live, that people are saying, I don't need 5 minutes to make a change. So I always like to teach quick tricks, to have a medicine bag of things that one thing doesn't always work all the time. What can we do that's going to make a difference in our healing that we know that we can use and check out? It doesn't hurt. Humming doesn't hurt at all. And the next slide, it's like, well, how can we bring peace to ourselves? We can hum to ourselves. We can hug. We can laugh. Simple things that sound like this is just nonsense. But in fact, at a cellular level, we know all of this changes the cell consciousness, if you will, the cell tension, and ultimately the biochemistry. And I always recommend to people, make a playlist of music that makes a difference in your life. And if you are in this angst with the caca going on in your brain, what else can you do? You can hum, turn on some music, move and dance. Don't be afraid to dance as if nobody's watching. And if we look at the next slide, a reminder how we can engage ourselves, how we can engage our cellular intelligence is, my cells are string instruments. What can I do that will vibrate them into a state of resonance, in a state of being together with all the other cells, mind and body? I see my sound and humming and music as the key thing that brings all of us together. It engages the brain, engages the cells, engages the body. I would say it's the biggest healer that we can use. And when all else fails, take your cells for a walk. I'm always recommending taking your cells for a walk. My neighbors take their dogs for a walk. I take my cells for a walk. And let's look at that. I think it's the next slide is a reminder of what I was saying earlier. Our cells are always in the now. They don't time travel. So the only thing that puts them into angst is if we think we're worrying about what's going to happen in the future or what almost happened yesterday. That's changing the tension. That's changing the chemistry of the body. And we need to bring ourselves back to now. It's not that hard to do. And in the next slide, well, if you begin to think about it, it's not that hard to do. In the next slide, a reminder that our cells are conscious, our cells are intelligent, and we can use our physical body to change our consciousness. It's often harder to change our attitudes and our thoughts, but it's easy enough to just take our body and do something different that's going to engage us with our cellular intelligence and our cellular consciousness and wisdom. And in the next slide, this is a reminder. This is a reminder. So this is from an old tricycle magazine. It was a Buddhist magazine on Buddhism and science. And I was struck by the fact that this drawing of Buddha was filled with strings. And so an ongoing question I've had in understanding who we are is, did the ancient practitioners of Buddhism see inside? Were they able to see that we were in fact a string instrument? And is that why this drawing evolved this way? Where does our information come from? Where do our practices come from? And in the next slide, it's just a reiteration of the things that access our cellular intelligence, our body-mind wisdom. It's a partnership. It's a partnership that we have with ourselves. What do our attitudes, what are our thoughts, what our behaviors do that influence ourselves? We can start the dance and do it both ways. It's like I'm inviting you to fall in love. Fall in love with yourselves. Tell them you love them. This week is when I'm doing this, it's Valentine's week. Fall in love with yourselves. And in the very last slide, we look at Buddha, who's saying, in the end, what matters most is how well did you love? How well did you live? How well did you learn to let go? And the question for me is, letting go is such an important part in spiritual maturation. Were the wise people who came up with these concepts tuned in to that their cells let go to mature? And on that note, I'm going to leave you with the wisdom and intelligence of your cells and getting to know them better.
Beautiful. And I'm sitting here hanging on for the next thing. Do we have a practice practice in there, or a way that maybe you can walk us through an experience of communicating with our cells? You mentioned that you have like lots of different tools and techniques that we can use in our toolbox. Can you share one or some with us?
I can share one or two.
Okay. We'll take it.
Okay, good. Because I was thinking of I knew what I wanted to do, but from your question, I realized there's a simpler one that I could also do. So one is getting in touch with your cells, and one is getting in touch with a bigger concept. So if it's okay with you to be able to do both.
It's more than okay. Yes, please.
Okay. So I'll invite you all to sit and be in a relaxed state of mind, or be in a relaxed body, and feel where your body touches the chair, where your feet touch the floor. Feel your breath as it comes in your nostrils and as it leaves. And with each deep breath, you're letting go of any mind chatter of where this is going to take you, and just be in the present moment. And feel your body. Take a few more deep breaths. And then bring your awareness to the place that feels like the center of you. Where's the center right now? There's no right or wrong. It's just what's that place. And sense it, feel it, imagine it. And then bring your awareness to what feels like the outside of you, your outside edge. It might be at your skin, it might be beyond that. Again, this is a simple awareness from the core center to your outer edge. And you can imagine, if you will, that core center is the nucleus, the center of your cell self. And the outer edge is your cell membrane that's taking in information from your environment. And then to bring those together, what we do to tune our cytoskeleton is we're going to hum, which means you take a deep breath in, and on the exhalation with your mouth closed, hum with your own breathing, your own rate of breath. Breathe in. And take another 2 deep breaths in and hum at your own pace. And just notice what you feel. And stay with that. Stay with what you're experiencing in your body. You may feel yourself tingling or vibrating. Know that you've got all your cells in tune. You've got your cell self to be able to connect with in a new way. And I'm going to take you into another way to connect with your cells, which will take a little bit longer than this guided experience. So once more, I'm inviting you to feel yourself either sitting down or lying down. Feel where your body touches the chair, where your feet are touching the floor, and recognize that whatever you experience does no harm. This is a way of getting inside. I want you to bring your awareness, your attention, to a place on your forehead and imagine or sense or feel that that place on your forehead is breathing. And then bring your awareness to a place underneath your nose, above your lips, and imagine or sense, or pretend if you have to, that that place is breathing. And now bring your attention to a spot on your chin and feel your chin breathing. And bring your attention to your throat area and experience, feel, sense that an area of your throat is breathing. And now feel or sense that your shoulders are breathing. And bring your attention to the inside of your elbows and feel, sense, pretend that your inside of your elbows is breathing. And now attend to the palms of your hands and feel the palms of your hands breathing. And bring your awareness to your outer thighs and sense or feel that your outside of your thighs is breathing. And now bring your awareness down to your feet and feel the outside of your ankles breathe. And now the soles of your feet are breathing. And your inside ankle is breathing. And next, bring your attention to behind your knees and feel the crease behind your knees breathe. And now feel your belly breathe. Feel your belly move as you breathe. And now bring your attention to your rib cage, the cradle for your heart, and feel your rib cage move as you breathe. And now feel your heart breathe. Feel your heart move as you breathe. You might even hear it. You might even hear the beat of your heart. And allow your experience of your heart to be as tangible as possible. Feeling it, hearing it, sensing it. And now with your heart, I want you to remember a time or a place for which you felt great gratitude. Or maybe it's a time or a place where someone was grateful for you. So you're remembering with your heart, all those cells in your heart, an experience of appreciation and gratitude. And allow that to become as real, as tangible as you can. Seeing where you were, hearing the sounds or hearing the words where you were. If there are any smells from that experience. So you're bringing all your sensory intelligence into this memory and experience of gratitude. And know that as you're experiencing this gratitude, that you're broadcasting that experience to all the cells in your body. You're broadcasting it from the beat of your heart up to your shoulders, up to your head, into your brain, with the beat of your heart down in your belly, down your legs to your feet. Every part of you is resonating with the experience and memory of gratitude. Every part of you is feeling grateful. All your cells remember that. And a way to help your cells anchor this even more, you can press your thumb and your first finger together. That helps ground this memory, so that every time you touch your finger and thumb together, you can recall this experience of gratitude. You might even take a moment or two to express some gratitude for your cells. Thank them for getting you here. Thank you for letting them experience this. Recall this amazing memory. Could be happy, could be sad. It's an experience that your cells want you to be reminded of. And you can put your hand on your heart to also help remember that your heart knows, your cells know who and what you are and are grateful for you. And know that you can come here anytime you need to. In appreciation. And when you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes. And if you need to or want to, write down what you experienced, kind of like a dream. And welcome back to a life of being grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Sondra, just to pick up off of that kind of exercise, you mentioned during the presentation that we should work with molecules of peace and of love, and that it was up to us to visualize this, can you talk a little bit about how we might work with those molecules and exactly what does that mean? Is that something that we envision constellating around stuck places or hard challenges that we're facing?
Well, I think, Christy, it's like being able to tap into what we have available to us. And in the old days, when I used to teach guided visualization around the country to health educators, I used to use the message, remember time of feeling loved or feeling appreciated. I didn't use feeling appreciated, feeling peaceful. And these would be in large audiences. And I learned from them that there were always people who could never experience feeling loved or feeling peaceful. That wasn't part of their repertoire. And what I discovered was what was part of everybody's repertoire was at least feeling grateful, even if we have to make it up. I mean, we've got Oprah talking about keeping a gratitude journal, Carolyn Mace talking about an attitude of gratitude. So it's like, what can we do every day that we can think of, what am I grateful for, even with all the stuff going on that we may not like? What am I grateful for? Oh, the sun came out this morning, or I had a good cup of coffee. So to be able to be proactive in what can I do that's why I use music. What can I do that's going to take me out of that negative state? It's not to make that negative state isn't happening, but if it's running us, it's running the chemistry and our physiology and our health. So what are reproducible ways to find those molecules of love? I might say, well, you could look at that. It's like I have a picture of the molecule that regenerates energy in the body. And I look at that sometimes if I'm really down. It's like, so what are the ways? Most people don't have photographs of molecules. So what are ways that touch us into our heart? I mean, I think that's really, where to go with it. What brings me into my heart? And to recognize our heart has an intelligence. That's one reason I do this exercise, to get us into a state of gratitude, even if it's simply remembering our cells. Mm-hmm. It's pretty amazing that they can generate these molecules for us.
Well, indeed, as you were carrying us through those exercises, I felt a sensation of more spaciousness in my body, and I felt more resilient, or more like I was my own sort of resource, to my own life. And so when we are in these practices, how important is it that we know where we're sending energy to, or how those molecules kind of shape up in our mind's eye? Is it more just the state of being receptive or grateful or loving?
A great question. I don't think we need to know about the molecules, where they're going, or the cells, where they're sending their messages to. It's what we call state-dependent learning. How do I feel? It's like when I did that first exercise with you, I feel my whole body vibrating. Like, oh, that's pretty cool. I don't do this every day. Like, okay, so how do we get to a physical state that brings us more into a state of well-being? Knowing that our molecules and cells are doing it helps to start, but what keeps us with it is the experience or the embodiment of, oh, okay, that made me feel more open, or that gave me, like you're saying, it gave me more of a resource that I have available. That, thank you, mm-hmm. That in your cells or molecules are doing it, but we don't need to know that, really.
Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit more about the experience of working with kids when you brought them photographs of cellular activity and showed them sort of what was happening in the body? Did did you get a response from the kids of more connection with their own internal life or their own idea about their own cellular activity?
Good question. I mean, basically, when I was doing the slideshows, it was to kids waiting for chemotherapy and their siblings. So there were kids from 2 to 18 in the room. I never really quizzed them on what they're experiencing. But what I saw later on, when I would be, there was something here called Center of Attitudinal Healing that worked with children whose parents had cancer or that they had cancer. And I would do slideshows for them. And the leaders of the group would always say how calm the kids got from looking at the cells, because the kids would come in really distracted. Maybe their mom is sick with chemo. It was more that group that I saw responses from the leaders of the group saying, you got, they were saying, you got a room full of very distracted kids, rambunctious, not wanting to sit down until they started seeing the pictures. That's one reason I keep on doing the photography, is there seems to be a certain calmness that people get when they see this. They may never remember a word I say, but wow, this is me, or this is us. Mm-hmm. So I've experienced enough times that there's a calm, a peacefulness from just the pictures. I always want to just do a slideshow, but people say I need to do words with it.
Well, was it in fact the journey from, I mean, because you're still teaching and educating and researching, and I'm wondering whether that was the connection to make all of your scientific work, so much of this deep scientific study, accessible to lay people through the photography. Was that what got you started on this path of
Absolutely, it's what got me started. It was moms, here I'm the only non-medical person down in pediatric oncology, and moms would start asking me about, what do I feed my sick child? Or the sick child is getting all the attention and the healthy children are jealous. So they would start asking me questions that only as a parent did I have any kind of sense. I wasn't trained, I always say I wasn't trained as a people person. I was trained as a scientist. And it really felt, part of the journey was when I realized that I was starting to really work with children who were likely to die, at least at that point, those times. I had no idea how to deal with that. So I went to a clinical psychologist who I write a lot about in the cell book, who turned out to be a shaman. And I didn't know how to deal with my emotions. And so I started working with him on how to deal with my emotions and to recognize spirit. All the things I started doing for my own emotional healing, being a woman in a male environment was very stressful. I started sharing with the kids and then started sharing with adults. And it just moved into being much more valuable to me than doing research. It's like, well, how can I teach people that will help them access their own healing, their own well-being? I might not be able to give them anything that cures their disease, but gets them into a state of feeling better about the moment. That was kind of a long journey.
Well, I had heard you say in another interview when I was preparing for our talk today, you didn't share it here, but I want to bring it into this conversation. You had mentioned that our cells carry ancient information from our ancestors, from our shared deeper histories. Can you talk a little bit about that and what those implications are for us today when we unlock that vast body of knowledge?
That's always my cutting edge of where I go. I mean, my belief has been basically through the microscope, going through the microscope, is that the cells have been our teachers, that everything our cells must do for health, we must do. And I look, I've really gotten into more of the molecular story, that they're not just chemicals, that there's intelligence and wisdom even in the chemicals. So one of my overriding themes, I say it's the next book, God was a biochemist, or where did all this spiritual information come from? Were people, they didn't name what they saw as cells or molecules. That wasn't part of their language, but they were able to access inside and see what was going on. Many years ago when I was teaching Qigong and mind-body medicine, I saw that the movements of the cell were very much like we see in Qigong or Tai Chi. So it's like, well, is that where they really came from? So I'm always asking the question, what's the root of knowledge? Because, as you see in Secrets of Your Cells, there's a page of lessons from our cells. They are our teachers. And they are teachers, and a perfect example of what I've addressed today is molecules have to embrace other molecules in order for something to make a change. The cell receptors have to embrace the information. It's not just they're static. It's not a lock and key. There's an embrace that goes on. So I'm always translating then, well, what do I have to embrace for my life? Or what am I not embracing for my life? To recognize every facet of our cellular molecular universe is a teacher. And I believe the ancient seers, wisdom people went inside, and that's what they were tapping into. It's like, well, where did let go come from? Yeah, it's a psychological perspective, but our cells let go, and our cells let go to mature. Was that an accident? I don't know. Somebody who wants to study that in detail can find out. I just speculate and say, it's possible that our molecules and cells are really the ultimate teachers here, and all we have to do is tune in.
As I'm hearing you talk, I can't help but make parallels to the greater body of humankind and how important it is to embrace differences and embrace our challenges in order to grow and mature. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I think that there are really some very strong connections to this work on the inner landscape and the outer one too.
Absolutely. I've been working on a film project. It's still in its early days, which is to look at under our skin, we're all the same. The color of our skin is just the color of our skin, but underneath, we're all the same. If we could really recognize that at a cellular, molecular, energetic level, maybe we wouldn't have so much bias, racism that we've got, because we're all the same. We're just all the same. Even our DNA, the molecules in the DNA is the same as in the plants. We need the trees to be able to breathe so we can breathe. I mean, there's such a collaboration, partnership in the universe. I just look at it as, the question I've asked, would we love each other more? Would we tolerate each other? Not tolerate is a bad word. Would we appreciate each other if we really saw how beautiful we all are underneath? If we really understood we're all the same. It's just the clothing of our skin that makes us look different. I don't know if that answers the question.
It really goes, I think it goes a long way toward answering it. I don't know that there is an answer to the question, but I appreciate how beautifully you shared your response there.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got time for one last question, and I've got so many notes here. I'm just going to pick one. Sometimes it's so hard to connect just to our our thoughts, just to slow down long enough to say, to check in with ourselves. Can you leave us with maybe one other tip to tune in on a daily basis and really cultivate that exchange of information with ourselves?
One thing I've started doing, which seems to be making a difference, well, besides doing gratitude, I write a gratitude journal every night. What 3 things am I grateful for? And I start the day with writing down, how do I want to feel today? And I will write 3 or 4, whatever comes to mind. It's totally intuition. It's not thinking about it. It's like, how do I want to feel? And sometimes I tune into that writing in the middle of the day and, well, did I get there? Or what do I need to be there? So it's something about the intention of the day. This is how I want to feel. And at the end of the day, I'll look at it and say, nah, you didn't do it. You didn't get any of that. You were in your mind chatter and caca. But often I'm seeing that the more I do that, and I've been doing it for about 6 months, that I'm more likely, having written that intention, this is how I want to feel, loving, connected, blah, 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 that I'm more likely to be there than not. So it's an easy tip. It goes along with the gratitude. It's like I write gratitude at the end of the day. Sometimes in the morning I'll think it while I'm still in bed. But making a difference, like, how do I want to feel? Not just at the end of the day, but how do I want to feel?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful, holistic approach to just getting in touch with ourselves and ourselves.
Thank you. It was a real treat. Thank you. And thank you for your questions. They always make me think and feel. Great, Christy.
Thank you so much, Sondra. And I also want to thank those of you who joined us for today's session. Please note that the recording of this session will remain accessible for free for 24 hours. And if you wish, you can purchase the entire summit with lifetime access to each recording, transcripts from each session, and bonus gifts from our presenters. For Sounds True, I'm Christy Peoples, thanking you once again, and thanks to Sondra Barrett for being with us. SoundsTrue.com, waking up the world.